All right, here we go. This week we're going to be covering chapter 2. And so again, hopefully by this point you have completed your quiz. Again, not mandatory to do it in that order, just something that I recommend. And so this week you're going to do your quiz, complete your personal narrative by February 12th. And then you also have an activism project due. So there'll be a separate video for you to watch on your activism project. And that's just going to walk you through, but all the information is on the syllabus. So if you're wondering what the project is, what's required, etc., that information is on the syllabus. And so go ahead and take a look at that. And let's just jump right in. This chapter is pretty short, very important, but also information that you have more than likely already been exposed to, such as the scientific method, etc. I'm going to add a sociological spin on what that means and what that means to sociology. And so let me get my screen all ready. All righty, so let's put this in mode that you can view. Okay. So chapter 2 is on sociological research. So sociology, although many people do not understand this, at least when they first take it, sociology is a science. So oftentimes when you're thinking about science, you're thinking about biology and chemistry and, those very what they call hard sciences. Sociology is most definitely still a science. We definitely go through the same process of start to finish, formulating hypotheses, finding conclusions, etc. Our process, though, is a little bit different, and I'll explain to you why. So first thing, I want to touch back on chapter 1 and when we talked about Auguste Comte and positivism. So positivism is this idea that there's one truth to be had, and one truth to be told, and it can only be obtained through science, right? And so we talked about kind of the issues about that in what science has been used for in the past, right? Scientific racism, so the eugenics movement and using science to try and prove that Black people were inferior, used as a justification for enslavement. So and that's not the only community that it has been used against. Like science was used against women, against the people from the LGBTQ population. And so it's been used to target marginalized communities and basically say, okay, look, there's something wrong with you, right? Here's how we can prove that. We're going to use science to prove that. So always keep that in your mind. Always keep that in the back of your mind. It's very, very important because, and that's not to say that science is not true. That's not to say that science, whatever. It can be problematic, right? It can be problematic. And so in sociology, we do use the scientific method somewhat. So we don't necessarily, some researchers don't necessarily follow it from point A to point B. And we'll kind of talk about why. But the scientific method is a systematic, organized series of steps that tries to obtain maximum objectivity and consistency in researching a problem. And so this part right here, obtaining maximum objectivity, this is where sociology kind of disagrees in some sense. So being objective basically means that you're removing yourself from your research. Like no matter who does this, you're going to come to the same conclusion. You're not supposed to insert your own biases or your own feelings or your own likings to a certain topic and things like that into your research. And so in sociology, we don't necessarily find that objectivity is necessary to complete research, right? Like we absolutely acknowledge that if I'm a human, I'm a person, right? I'm a Black woman, I'm from whatever type of background, I'm from California, insert all of the things that kind of make up my identity. I can't remove that when I go out into the world to conduct research, right? Like that I'm bringing along with me pieces of myself. And so that is where, so just a quick overview of the scientific method. So defining the problem, reviewing the literature, formulate a hypothesis, collect and analyze data, and develop a conclusion. So this is kind of where sociology may, in a general like hard science, let's say biology class, right? You're really taught to go from point A which is defining the problem, and work your way through as steps. Like you have to start with A, then go to B, C, D, and end up with a conclusion. Sociology, not so much. You don't necessarily have to follow this very perfect idea of what the scientific method is. So maybe you already have your hypothesis, right? You already think that, let's say, someone's socioeconomic status is going to impact their health. So someone's class status, whether you're poor, middle class, or rich, is going to have an influence on your health. That's a hypothesis, right? So maybe I'm already going into my study understanding that as something that I want to test, right? So then I jump to defining the problem. Well, what is the problem, right? That our society is built upon, class status in which people who are poor have less access to healthy foods than people who are rich, right? And so that can be proven with data, right? There's absolutely connections between quality of food, between access to healthy foods, and someone's class status. So poor neighborhoods are less likely to have, access to like whole foods. Like, you walk into a grocery store and you see just a ton of fresh fruits and vegetables. Less likely to be seen in a poor neighborhood than a rich or middle class neighborhood. And so if you're talking about issues of health, we know that what we eat and what we consume impacts our health. So in poor neighborhoods, they're more likely to have fast food restaurants. They have way more liquor stores, right? Like all of this is proven in research. And so I encourage you to think about where you live, encourage you to think about neighborhoods that you know, and kind of take a look around, right? How many Fraser farms do we have in this region? How many Sprouts do we have in this region? And think about the neighborhoods in which those are located, right? And it's interesting because you can really, really see those connections. Like there used to be Fresh and Easy, they went out of business, but there was, when a Fresh and Easy popped up in Vista, that was very, very like shocking to the community, because it's like, oh wow, we have this really large healthy food store that is not typically seen in those types of neighborhoods. And so maybe you go from formulating your hypothesis to defining the problem, then you're going to review the literature, which is where you would have found some of the information that I was kind of spewing out. And then that's when you go and collect and analyze your data. So maybe you drive around and talk to people who have lived in Oceanside or Vista or Escondido or whatever region you want to look at, and ask them how long they've lived there. Maybe even ask them if they've ever shopped at Fraser Farms or Whole Foods, because we only have a few in this area, and they're most definitely not located in what you would consider like a low-income poor neighborhood. And so from all of that, you collect all your data, you either talk to people or maybe you administer surveys, you develop a conclusion. So you say that socioeconomic status does have an impact on someone's health and access to healthy foods. And so this is where sociology really, really takes a spin on this thing called the scientific method, right? And that is, this understanding of standpoint theory. So knowledge stems from our social position in society. This perspective denies that traditional science is objective and suggests that research and theory have ignored the marginalization of women and women of color. And so when you look at research that has been produced, textbooks that have been produced, they typically, I would say overwhelmingly, produce things from a very white male standpoint. And that's not to say that, they don't talk about Martin Luther King, or they don't talk, they pick and choose. They don't talk about Cesar Chavez. They don't talk, they pick and choose kind of what their diversity looks like, but the perspective that it's being written from is very much white and male, because that is who education was built for. At the time, like think about it, when schools were built, who was allowed to attend school? Women were not allowed to attend school. People of color were not allowed to attend school. And so by process of elimination, the people who were allowed to become educated, the people in which education was founded to educate, were very much white elite males, right? And so from then, they're the ones who their perspectives were inserted in textbooks as truth. That's where you get scientific racism and the eugenics movement, right? All of this stuff is very much connected. And so in standpoint theory, it's saying that someone's positionality, someone's identity, right? Like my identity as a Black woman is going to have an influence on the type of research that I choose to do, what communities I choose to research, how I go about conducting my research, right? So maybe I'm somebody who values people's stories and perspectives on things. So I'm going to choose a qualitative, like an interview process for my method, right? And we'll talk about the different types of methods. But all of that plays a role in how you go about conducting research. And so I encourage you to think about like your own standpoint, your own perspective on different aspects of your social world, different aspects of society, and how you would go about conducting research. And so just to kind of put this into like a real everyday understanding of standpoint theory, is that someone's view, for instance, of incarceration, right? Someone being incarceration is this large system of sending people to prison for multiple reasons, right? Multiple reasons. It's definitely, we'll talk about, we have a whole lecture on incarceration and the school to prison pipeline in particular. But let's just kind of make this a very real and tangible example of how someone's standpoint influences their perspective. And so this is not something that you actually have to do. We're just going to walk through this very, very quickly. If we were in class or like live on Zoom, we would kind of do breakout rooms and talk about this within groups and make this a true activity, but I'm just going to walk you through it. So positionalities are these right here. So these identities that I've attached, and I've made them very much opposites on purpose. I've done this very much on a dichotomy. So a dichotomy is like, if you're on one end of the spectrum, I'm on the complete opposite. And so this changes, right? You can absolutely take like white upper class male perspective, Black lower class female perspective. Again, those are two polar opposites, just looking at race, right? Opposite races, opposite class status, opposite sex or gender. But you can also even positionalities, Black men and Black women, right? White men and white women, Latino men and Latinx men and Latinx women, right? And so it's just really kind of looking at the differences in the identities that folks have. But if you were a white upper class male, right? White upper class male, your views on incarceration are going to be very, very different than a Black lower class female, right? Your ideas around why people go to jail are going to be very different. Your ideas around punishment are going to be very different. And again, I'm going to make this very, very real for us because we live in this type of social world. Take people who, the Trump supporters that barged the Capitol, right? Regardless of your views on that, they were overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly male and female, right? So their perspectives about the election were very different than people of color, than Black and brown folks who more than likely, and I think the ones, I can't say that all of those people were from a particular class status, because I don't think there's anything that points to any like tangible thing that says these people were either rich or poor or middle class, whatever. There was a mix, but race, right? We saw race being played out at the Capitol. They were overwhelmingly white males and females. Their perspectives of the election, the authenticity, their perspectives of Donald Trump and his abilities and his politics are very different than Black and brown people, right? Different standpoints. And so if you were going to go out and research electoral politics, right? Electoral politics, those two groups, those two different positionalities, those two different standpoints are going to have very different results, very different approaches, very different understandings of what the problem is or what's important to talk about, right? So just keep that in mind, that we cannot remove ourselves from research. And that may be very different than what you either have been taught in a biology or chemistry or physics, et cetera, class. And yet it's important to understand, right? It's very, very, very important to understand. And so other aspects of the scientific method, again, I'm pretty sure you've heard this, so we're not going to spend a ton of time talking about this. It becomes very important when you are actually going out to conduct research, right? Knowing the independent and dependent variables. But just think of it as, and this for some reason was always very confusing to me until I became a sociologist. So like in my biology class, it was very, very hard for me to understand independent versus dependent variables. My brain just was not computing the difference until it became a real part of my social world, like understanding cause and effect. You think of independent and dependent as cause and effect. So how does socioeconomic status affect health? Independent variable is your socioeconomic status. Health is your dependent variable, right? Your health depends on your socioeconomic status. And so you can kind of work your way through that example. Some other important things to keep in mind about scientific method is this idea of validity and reliability. Validity is how well a test measures what it's intended to measure. So this is actually really, really important, right? So if I go out and I conduct a survey and I'm asking, my goal is to find out if socioeconomic status affects health. My questions really need to make it clear to the people taking that survey that that's what I'm getting at, that's what I'm wondering, that's what's important for me to understand. And so if I'm asking questions about like, what types of movies do you watch? What channel, things that are unrelated to what I'm actually assessing, that may not be a valid survey. I might not yield valid results. And so reliability is the degree to which an assessment tool provides stable and consistent results. So this is the idea that no matter like your survey, so say you're giving out a survey, no matter how many times you administer that, no matter what community you administer that in, you should still be getting very stable and consistent results. So you shouldn't see that like, if I did a survey at Maricosta College, right? And I handed it out to all the students during college hour, which is, well, there's no college hour right now, but it was like every Thursday from 12 to 1, there's really no classes. It's kind of like, everyone's just out chilling, eating, doing what they do. So if I did that every day for a week, if I had a reliable assessment tool, so if my survey was very reliable, I would see the same, not necessarily the same results, but consistent results, right? Consistent. The fact that, everyone is answering them, everyone is responding in a very not similar manner, because again, people, just because we go to the same college doesn't mean we have the same politics or the same background or understanding, especially at a community college. And so there's different types of research designs. So when you're going out to, so say you've worked your way through your scientific method, that part that says collect and analyze data, that's where this research design comes into play. So you have quantitative and qualitative methods. Quantitative, just think of data, surveys, looking at statistics. There's a thing called inferential statistics, so using data to make a prediction on life outcomes. So this may be that you're looking at data that has already been collected. So it's not necessarily that you are collecting the data, but maybe you're going into archives like databases, looking at census data, looking at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, like looking at results that have already been put out there and making assumptions or making developing conclusions based on those. And so I personally, I have done quite a few different quantitative research studies, especially in graduate school. It's a requirement, but it's not my thing. I'm not someone who heavily relies or feels inclined to use data. It's important. I'm not saying that looking at data, looking at 56% of people who responded said X, Y, and Z. Like anytime you see that type of stuff, that was done through a survey. That's a quantitative research design. Qualitative is this thing like interviews. So going out and asking people questions and hearing their responses. It's participant observation. So maybe you're sitting in a coffee shop and writing down everything that you see. And, that is a form of research, right? And let's say you do that every day and you become, you start to understand people's patterns of behavior. So maybe you see the same guy come in every day and watch his interactions and his treatment of the baristas, right? And that is data, right? That is data. Content analysis. We do this all the time. If you're on social media, you are constantly looking at people's content and either responding, whether it's to yourself, whether it's to your friends, sharing, whatever. But content analysis is, for instance, I did a content analysis study where I looked at how women are portrayed in advertisements. So I would just go through magazines, look at commercials. Carl's Jr. was great for my study back when they were using women as props for burgers. If you haven't seen that, I would say go on YouTube, but they're just really bad, at least for me. For a while, I did not eat Carl's Jr. But content analysis is really just looking at the data, looking at these advertisements and saying, well, women, are usually used as props. Women are usually very sexualized. So either they have minimal clothing on or they're behaving in a very sexually promiscuous way, right? Like that, you can start to notice these very particular patterns when looking at specific content. And ethnography is when you go, so there's ethnography, there's an auto ethnography, which is like me, so auto is self. So let's say I go about every single day and I just walk through the mall, right? I'm making it very simple. I walk through the mall and I just note everything that's kind of happening to me. I notice how people look, how people respond, what stores people are going to. Like, it's just very much documenting your day to day. And ethnography of other people would be, maybe you want to find out how women in leadership positions in a company are treated. And so maybe you intern or you just ask, a woman who's in leadership, like, hey, can I tag along? Like, I'm doing this research study and I'm looking at how women are treated in the workplace who are in positions of power. And so you literally follow them, right? You follow them around, you join them in meetings, you join them in committee meetings and write down and start to use that as data as to how they are treated in their interactions with other people. And so that's my favorite type of research, is qualitative. I just feel like it really allows, one, people to speak for themselves. So the interview process, there are certain things that it's very difficult to study quantitatively. Like, how do you collect data on treatment or experience? Like, if you're wanting to know the experience of women in the workplace, how, on a survey and you're scaling, like on a scale from 0 to 5, how comfortable are you at work? That tells you like about this much, right? But what about your workplace makes you, a 3, right? Versus a 0 where you are not comfortable at all. So that's kind of the piece that qualitative research allows you to do, is understand, well, why? You answered a 3 on this survey, but what about your environment makes you uncomfortable? Or what about your experiences make you, feel like you're not respected? So it just allows people, it brings the data to life, in my opinion. And so we are not going to do this, obviously, but choosing a research design is very much going to depend on what you're looking to know, like what you're looking to know. So if we want to find out how students feel about their college professors, right? Feel, like, how do you measure feeling in a survey, right? How do you investigate building community in a survey? Like, there's very particular verbiage that you use, and that'll kind of indicate to you which research design that you should be using. And so, there's additional pieces to this research process that are really important to keep in mind. So this idea of ethics. Ethics is very, 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 very important when you're conducting research, to the point that when you are especially in graduate school, you have to go through, it's called an institutional review board. You basically have to, before you can collect any data or complete your master's, right? For your master's, at least in most behavioral sciences like sociology, you have to conduct your own original research project. So you go out, you do your own study. You have to prove to the institutional review board that what you're doing is going to be ethical. And so ethics is a set of guiding principles constructed by a governing organization that's used to determine appropriate behavior or proper conduct. So basically, they're trying to make sure you have this understanding of informed consent and that you are not going out to commit harm. That what you're doing is not going to harm communities, it's not going to harm people. And so this idea of ethics and informed consent really came out of some very horrible scientific studies that happened. So the first one being the Tuskegee syphilis, well, not the first, I guess if you're going in order, the Jewish Holocaust would come first. But anyways, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment happened for 40 years. They took Black men in particular, and they essentially like gave them syphilis, right? They gave them syphilis, or they were already syphilis positive, okay? And they did not let them know that they were a part of a research study. They did not give them the full background of what they were trying to accomplish. And so what happened was they allowed they wanted to study the different stages of syphilis, right? This was before we really knew what the disease did, and the outcomes, etc. They wanted to study the different stages of syphilis, right? And so they used Black men as guinea pigs for their research study. And even after there was a cure, they did not let their participants know. So these men died, right? These men died during this process because syphilis is a very deadly disease. It's a very deadly disease. And yet, it was very, there's videos that I usually show videos in class that really kind of walk you through the harms that were done, not picture wise, but just, the harms that were done. And so if you'd like to, feel free to go to YouTube and look up these experiments, but in general, they were not informing their participants of what they were getting themselves into. They had no idea, the outcomes or the consequences for being a part of these studies. And so now you have to make sure that you have to give your participants a list of risks. So being a part of this study, here are the following risks. It doesn't even matter if you say, like, if it's only an emotional harm, you have to put that in there. Like, this could cause, you to relive some traumas that you've experienced. You have to put that in because they have to sign a form, and you have to submit all your forms. You have to keep them for 5 years. Like, there's all of these very particular steps that you have to go through when you're conducting your research. But you essentially, and you have to tell them, like, how are you going to protect your participants? And so one that is very difficult to get past through an IRB is studying undocumented communities. How are you going to protect your participants' anonymity? How are you going to keep them anonymous, right? If you're looking at undocumented students at Miracosta, right? How are you going to say that you can keep their information confidential and anonymous? Because that is a very protected and very vulnerable population of people, right? There's consequences for if you were able to find out the exact people that you're studying. And so you as a researcher have to make sure you're protecting your participants. You have to demonstrate to whatever community colleges don't have an institutional review board, but hypothetically, you have to protect, and let them know how you are going to, they call it a safeguard, how you're going to safeguard your participants. And so one thing that, again, we're almost done, y'all, but the last kind of understanding of sociology as a science and sociology in conducting research is understanding like social movements. So should the goal of research be social change? Like, if I'm going to study the effects of socioeconomic status on health, am I just going to study and I find out that poor people are more likely to die of cancer, more likely to be obese, right? I'm going to find all of these things out and then that's it, right? That's it. All right, sorry, sucks if you're poor. This is what I found, right? The idea of sociology and understanding it through a sociological perspective is bringing about social change. And that's where these social movements come from. So you have very much these large social movements that go out and bring these issues to policymakers and say, look, we need more, whole food grocery stores in poor communities because here's why. Here's the research that says this is important. And so always think about that. And when you're doing your activism project, that's an important piece of it is your solutions for change, because We don't just want to study an issue and bring about all of the issues, and they can be very sad and overwhelming, especially if you're researching your own community. But how do we go about creating change? How do we go about creating change? And so this is what I want your personal narrative to be on, is I want you to write something. It doesn't have to be very particular. Well, you can choose a particular topic if you want. Actually, I encourage, let's scratch that. You will choose a particular topic. This does not have to be your activism topic, but just anything that you're passionate about, right? Whether it's like, body shaming women on social media. If that is going to be your issue, talk about the importance of social movements in our society, right? So talk about the importance of people like Amber Rose, who's a very prominent celebrity voice who shines light on body shaming and slut shaming women, right? So I want you to really talk about social movements, talk about the importance for, thinking about change in a particular topic. So let me just make that a little bit more clear, because I'm literally making this up on the spot. So it's a little rambled. You're gonna pick a social issue. It can be anything. And if you need to, Google social issues 2021. You'll come up with a great list. But I really encourage you to think of something that's meaningful to you. So what community are you a part of? Are you a part of the LGBTQ community? Are you a part of an undocumented community? Are you a part of the Black community? Are you a part of an Indigenous community? Like, think of a community that is important to you, and what social issues are brought about in that community. And how is that important for you, right? What important solutions for change, right, can you pose about your particular community that you're involved in? If you're not clear on that, because it was a little bit jumbled, if you're not clear, email me. I don't want to post it, because again, watching these videos are a requirement for the class. And so if you're not clear on how to approach your personal narrative, please, please, please send me an email. But in case you haven't noticed by now, as long as you turned in on time, you get full credit. Turn it in on time, show me that you put in effort, and I give full credit. I'm not somebody who's going to mark you down because you spelled something wrong or you didn't explain properly. Like, that's not my style of teaching. I want you to think yourself through this. I want you to engage in this process. And hopefully it's already becoming a fun process for you. So that's all we have for today. Please, again, send me an email as you all are navigating through this course. I hope that you are having a fun time so far. We haven't even hit I always say this is my favorite chapter. You'll probably hear me say that like 5 or 10 times, but it's because I love sociology, and everything we talk about is important to the social world that we're living in. And so hopefully you're starting to feel the same. But yeah, see you all next week.